Well, welcome back to Legal AF and Court Accountability Action. My name is Lisa Graves, and I am excited to talk with you about a really distressing case that is before the United States Supreme Court, before the Roberts Court right now, which is, I think, part of its assault on the separation of church and state, on longstanding core principles in this country about subsidizing religious indoctrination, religious education. And I am so excited to be joined by a real expert in these issues, Andrew Seidel, who's the Vice President of Strategic Communications for Americans United United for the Separation of Church and State. Andrew, it's an honor to be on with you. Thank you for joining us. And I wonder if we should just dive right into the Oklahoma case that's pending. And get your thoughts on it. And then I have some questions and some ideas myself, but let's just jump right in.
Yes, well, the court heard oral argument in the case this morning. And I mean, the simple version of this case is that we are talking about a religious public school. And hopefully every listener's brains just kind of ground to a halt trying to grasp that phrase. But that's what we are talking about. There's this group of Christian nationalists out there that are arguing that the government has to create and fund a religious public school. So what we're really effectively talking about whether this nation will allow Christian nationalists to take over our public school system. Now, when you get down into the nitty gritty, we can also say that it's about whether a state can force taxpayers to fund a religious school that is going to indoctrinate kids into one particular religion, they've said that, and is going to discriminate against students and against staff when they hire, along religious lines, along LGBTQ lines, along lines of ability versus disability. St. Isidore has said that they're going to refuse admission to anyone who doesn't share their religious beliefs, refuse admission to LGBTQ students and families, and asserted their right to discriminate against students with disabilities. So, I mean, we are really talking about something that is fundamentally un-American. That's forcing taxpayers to fund a religious public school. It's a breach of the separation of church and state. It's an affront to public education, and it is mind-boggling that we are even at a pass where the Supreme Court is considering this.
Yeah, it really is extraordinary. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited that we have this channel here with Legal AF. I want to make sure I ask people to subscribe and like and get ready to share this video, because this conversation is vitally important. It's important in part because right now, as Andrew mentioned, just this morning, the court is took up for the oral argument this case, which would radically change education policy, legal policy, constitutional policy in the United States. And let me just say, they're doing it on purpose. The U.S. Supreme Court gets 8,000 to 9,000 petitions for cert. Those are petitions asking the court to take a case. It's taking up between 60 and 70 cases a year. These are discretionary cases. It's decided to take this case. And it's decided to take this case after a couple of sessions now in a row where this Supreme Court, this Roberts Court, with a majority of Republican appointees and with 3 of the 6 Republican appointees being Trump appointees, has decided to rewrite the rules for religion in this country in ways that are diametrically opposed to the way our founding document, our charter, specifies. As Andrew, I'm sure, can speak to, the Constitution, or actually, one of the books that I have over here that I've read many times, which is the Godless Constitution. That's not a radical statement. That's an accurate statement. The Constitution forbids religious tests for office. It forbids the establishment of a religion. And this issue of whether we should be subsidizing religious indoctrination, I just have to read this and then ask you your thoughts on this, Andrew.
Yeah.
But, so I've got my handy Constitution here. I carry it with me basically at all times. This particular version from the United States Senate also has the Declaration of Independence and other provisions. And it includes the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty, which was adopted in 1786. And I just want the part here where they talk about what it means to have religious liberty is really on point. It specifically says that to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical. Yes. And that even the forcing him to support this or that teacher of his own religious persuasion is depriving him of the comfortable liberty of giving his contributions, to whomever he chooses. And so this battle over whether we should be subsidizing religious indoctrination is a battle that the Virginia Bill of Religious Liberty, was representing the sentiment at that time in our country and in the beginnings of our country, that it is a violation of conscience to be forced to subsidize someone else's religious indoctrination. But this right-wing Supreme Court seems poised to not just allow that, but require it. So I wonder if you could just respond and comment on that.
I mean, there's so much to unpack there, and you are, of course, right on. And that is one of my favorite quotes from American history, that it is sinful and tyrannical we're talking about government-enforced tithing, essentially. And that is a perfect encapsulation of where the true religious freedom right lies in this case. The true religious freedom right lies with every single citizen in Oklahoma, with every single taxpayer, not with the Catholic Church that's trying to form this school. The Catholic Church already has 30 plus schools in Oklahoma. They're free to open a school if they want. They want a public school. Specifically a public school, one that is publicly funded, that every single taxpayer would be forced to fund. And that is a violation of every single person's religious belief in that state. And this court, as you pointed out, has been on a crusade lately. In fact, I wrote a book called American Crusade, How the Supreme Court is Weaponizing Religious Freedom. These justices want to take these cases. They were put on the court to select and take these cases and decide them in favor of Christianity, right? We know that Leonard Leo was the, quote, monitor of the nominees' ideological purity when it came to judicial nominees. And he selected them so that they would go out there and do exactly what they're doing right now. And the data backs this up. There's some really great studies that have been done. And the numbers are a little stale because they don't include the 2022 term and on, which have been banner terms for Christian nationalists and this weaponized version of religious freedom that you mentioned. But before the Roberts Court was packed and captured, religion won before the court about 50% of the time, 47%, right? It's a coin flip. That's what you'd expect. But right. Under the Roberts Court, that win rate jumps to 81%. And it's not just a pro-religion or pro-religious freedom shift. It's a pro-Christian shift, because when you look at the different litigants, it's Christians that are winning before the court. Again, before Roberts, coin toss about 50% of the time. Under Roberts, it nearly doubles up to almost 80, 90%. So, and again, those numbers are more dramatic now, given the most recent terms since 2022 and onward. And in this case, it does look like we are going to see the court decide in favor of this school. And just one other point that I think is worth noting, like I always feel a little bit like a conspiracy theorist sometimes when we're talking about the Supreme Court these days and how Leonard Leo worked to pack it, and especially when we're talking about these religion cases. But this really is one of the primary goals that they've been working towards for decades, really even since Brown versus Board of Education. And there's a marker on it on the court today, and that's the fact that Amy Coney Barrett recused herself because she has such a close relationship with some of the Notre Dame professors who helped foster and bring this case, and who are kind of part of the Notre Dame Religious Liberty Clinic, which has helped create this case with a lot of the other Christian nationalist groups out there, like the Alliance Defending Freedom, whose lawyer was also in court arguing today.
Yeah, I was glad that she did the honorable thing and recused herself, because she does have such close ties. And as Heidi Presbala really wrote in her extraordinary investigation of the creation of this school, how tied the launch of this, is to that Notre Dame clinic, which is also received funding from Leonard Leo's new fortune, the fortune that he was given by Barry Seid in 2020, the $1.6 billion trust fund, in order to advance this extreme agenda, an agenda that is at odds with our founding documents and that history, but represents this sort of evangelical approach to, not just person-to-person sharing of religion, but this effort to use our public resources in order to advance particular religious agenda, religious indoctrination, not just, teachings about one particular faith, although in this instance it is about one particular faith, but also to use the Constitution's shield of religious liberty as a sword, as a weapon, as you wrote about in
Exactly.
your book. And that weaponization is one that really does threaten freedom of conscience for people and for people across the country, not just in Oklahoma, because if it's allowed to proceed in Oklahoma, it will be happening in nearly every state. Or if they're denied the chance to get their access to public funds, they'll sue under this precedent that is, in the process of being made, to demand that every state fund religious indoctrination, purely 100% religious schools with 100% public money. And, on a sort of personal level, when I think about the Catholic Church, I think of it as one of the richest churches, in the history of the churches in the world. It has
Yeah.
enormous resources. Now, some of those dioceses have tried to hide their resources or deflect away from settlements for the sexual abuse that was widely reported, that they allowed priests to be just transferred around despite the abuse that they were engaging in towards young people. But
Mhm.
but there's really no doubt that the Catholic Church has enormous wealth. It doesn't need the public subsidy to take money out of public schools and put them into religious schools. And as you point out, they have plenty of religious schools that their members, that their parishioners are supporting through paying tuition, or supporting those churches. So this is not a case of need or urgency or exigency. This is a choice of like a will, a desire, a demand to basically use this captured Supreme Court to remake the law in ways that enrich this church and other churches who would then come along and want to create their own Pentecostal public school or their own, name the religious school. I wonder what will happen when people want to then create Muslim schools or Buddhist schools or Hindu schools based on this precedent. But unlocking this door to basically redirecting our tax dollars to fund purely religious, schools that are on the surface and deep in their instruction, religious schools, this would be an extraordinary break from American history and an extraordinary breach and decimation of that wall between that separates church and state, for that wall that actually guarantees all of our freedom, that guarantees all of us have the freedom of conscience to decide what religion we practice and what religion, if any, we fund and support.
Yeah, it would be a sea change for American democracy. And public schools are one of the great pillars of American democracy, right? They help bring all these people of diverse backgrounds, diverse beliefs, diverse, you name, whatever spectrum you want to name, the diversity along it is manifested in our public school system. It's where we come together to learn the basics, and then we leave things like religious instruction to the family and to houses of worship to handle, right? Most of the time, these same groups don't want the government involved in religious inculcation. But as you point out here, when they're talking about being able to get public dollars to do it, their tune changes a little bit. And the point that I think you made that is right on is that this is a vast deviation from the way that the court has understood the relationship between church and state and the relationship between religion and public education, leaving it to the private individuals to make those decisions for almost our whole history. And over the last few years, this captured court has really dragged the case law, dragged the precedent, dragged our understanding of religious freedom so far to the extreme that it's almost unrecognizable. And that was present in the oral argument today. What we're really talking about is a charter school. This is a charter school. Under Oklahoma law, charter schools are very clearly defined as public schools. And the amount of control that the state has over the charter schools is huge. In fact, the fact that they are charter schools means that the state is chartering them. They come into existence when that charter is granted. They don't exist independently of the state, which is something that was argued quite well by the state of Oklahoma today. And there's this line of cases going back to Espinoza and Trinity Lutheran, which was a case out of Missouri, both of which I cover in my book, and then Carson versus Macon, where this captured Roberts court, has just completely butchered and manipulated and rewritten and perverted our understanding of religious freedom to essentially mean where we're going to end up is that the separation of church and state is hostile to religious freedom. That is where they are looking to take us, and where it seems like we may end up based on some of the oral argument that I heard today.
Wow, it really is extraordinary, because even with the recusal of Amy Coney Barrett, there are 5 Republican appointees on that court. And it sounded like, from the argument, the excerpts that I was able to catch, that it looks like they may have that 5-3 vote to allow
that
this.
would be my guess.
Yeah, and
that would be my guess.
And so basically, what we're seeing with this court being captured is you have this extreme overreach. I would call it overreach. I think they don't think of it as overreach at all. They think of it as opportunistic. They now have this court that's willing to basically advance this extreme vision, and they're going to tee up cases to do that. We're also seeing that in the case about the posting of the 10 Commandments in Louisiana, which is in direct violation of a previous precedent of the Burger Court, when Bill Rehnquist and others were on that court, a Republican majority court, but one that actually adhered to the precedents on the separation of church and state. We now have at least 5 judges, and in a future case where Barrett doesn't have to recuse, possibly 6 judges to embrace this radical reactionary agenda to force us to fund religious schools in the United States. Meanwhile, you have this sort of menacing dialogue, or rumor mongering on the right, where they claim to be afraid that we're going to have Islamic law, Sharia law. That was all the rage on Fox a few years ago, that supposedly we were going to have Muslim law in the United States. Complete fiction. And yet some of the same people and entities that are that were pushing that idea have no concern, or at least no dissent from pushing this agenda forward to advance basically Christian religious schooling as something that we, the taxpayers, have to fund. So, I mean, it is like the hypocrisy is extraordinary on the part of some of these entities. I would say Fox really comes to mind on that for me. But, this idea that that we now have a court captured in such a way, as you point out, by Leonard Leo's determination of who got on that list, who got on the short list, means that we have a court that's willing to basically destroy the separation of church and state. I think it's a terrible path that John Roberts has set this court on, along with his fellow Republican appointees. And I don't know if you have ideas about how can people respond, what to do if this decision comes down as is predicted. Like, what are the options for people to respond to this new era of basically the establishment of religion, in essence, through forced taxpayer money?
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in that as well. And I do want to point out that I think you're right to talk a little bit about Fox News there and the conservative media bubble, because it's been clear for some time that Justice Alito, for instance, is clearly saturated in the conservative media bubble. But there's this line of questioning that he had today, asking whether a charter school could focus its music on the music composed by dead white men, or could it include jazz and hip hop and rap in non-European countries? Then he talks about the perfectly legitimate lifestyle of LGBTQ people, or teaching the history from the 1619 Project. It is, he's going to teach American history the way that it was taught in 1955 and before. Like really clearly, this guy is just spending way too much time rotting his brain in front of Fox News, and the bitterness kind of comes through. So 2 points. One, the broader point, and is the short-sightedness of this crusade, because the only true guarantee for religious liberty anywhere is the separation of church and state. If the government can force you to fund a religion that is not your own, you do not have religious freedom. If the government can suggest that you should pray on a certain day, as it's going to tomorrow on the National Day of Prayer, or pray in a certain way, you do not have religious freedom. And
Yeah.
if you want true religious liberty, true religious freedom, that means separating religion from the government. James Madison told us that religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together, right? And that goes back to that debate that you were talking about in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. So this is short-sighted because the alliance between conservative Catholics and the white evangelicals that make up Christian nationalism today is not going to last forever. It's going to start fracturing. And there are actually already some fault lines that I'm working to drive some wedges into, if at all possible. And that's going to happen. And they're going to start wishing that they had that separation of church and state when the white evangelicals are forcing their schools on the country and we no longer have it. And it's sad, too, because Catholics throughout American history have been some of the best defenders of that separation of church and state. There's a real famous case here from the late 1800s here in Wisconsin called the Edgerton Bible case, where Catholics challenged the use of the King James Bible in a public school because that was not their Bible. And they didn't think that the state should be imposing it on their kids. And they won, and they should have won. And so it's short-sighted is one. And the separation of church and state is something that protects everybody. It's something that we should all agree on. It's an American original. It's an American invention. So I think that's one thing. But to your question of what people can do is I think after this, because we're talking about a charter school scheme, which is statutory and is written by the state, and we've already seen how vouchers are such a problem and do such a poor job of augmenting public education. I think what we need to start thinking about seriously is pushing for public dollars going to public schools. And now maybe that does include charter schools, but making sure that we are very, very clear under the law, which I already think Oklahoma has been, but that charter schools are religious schools, are public schools, right? And so that when public dollars are flowing there, it's only going to public education. So maybe it means more control for charter schools. Maybe it means getting rid of those voucher programs. Maybe it means that a lot of the school groups that we see out there and the parents groups that we see out there and the PTAs and everybody starts really getting behind defending public education in a very real way and saying, look, our bright line is that public dollars go to public schools because anything else violates our religious freedom, whatever this captured Supreme Court says.
Yeah,
but it does depend on the opinion. So we'll see what they say. But yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate those ideas, Andrew. When I think about religious liberty in the United States and religious freedom, I think that one of the reasons why so many religions have thrived in the United States is because there hasn't been an official religion. And other countries where they have a state religion or they have this sort of imposition, religion becomes associated with the government in a way that is unappetizing, is alienating in ways which we've seen in some of the rates of worship in Europe, in European countries. But in the United States, because we've had this long-standing separation of church and state, that has allowed not just religious freedom to thrive, but also, the freedom of conscience. The ability of people to have freedom of speech and freedom of ideas has thrived because we haven't had people being, forcibly taught or at least forced to subsidize the teaching of just one particular faith's point of view, whether that's on history and the age of the earth, or science or other matters. We have had a public school system that has been one that has honored people's rights as children to be from these different faiths, to come together in a pluralistic way, in a small d democracy way, to have people from different backgrounds, different religions, different economic statuses, different races, different ethnicities come together and learning together versus the sort of a religious segregation subsidized by the public. And I would be remiss if I didn't make a mention of, not just the fact that the Department of Education, as you point out, is under assault by this administration, trying to deauthorize it, trying to end the Department of Education, but also, and that's under Linda McMahon, a person who has helmed this entertainment wrestling empire, but has no actual experience in public schools, public education, how kids learn. But that she's just his second choice, Trump's second choice. The first choice that Trump had in his first administration for the Department of Education was Betsy DeVos, who, along with her husband, basically famously said they don't have a problem with public education. they just have a problem with public schools. And that was because they wanted the money. They want the money, the public dollars, to go into the private religious education. In their case, not Catholic education, but Protestant education in terms of the types of schools, the religious schools that they've been funding separately. They just don't want public schools. They want public money. And that is a through line among some of these right-wing GOP funders, right-wing people aligned with Leo and Trump on some of these issues, is this idea that what they want is the cash. They want the cash to go in to support their institutions, not to actually support truly public schools that are not religious, are not indoctrinating kids in a particular faith.
Yeah, I mean, so much great stuff there. And I wrote about that ostensible paradox with the religious diversity in a country and the separation of church and state in my first book, In the Founding Myth. But it's actually, you're right to kind of liken it to market forces. When there is an established religion, the church that is established has a monopoly. When they're with no competitors, with taxes supporting the church, and the priests grow fat and indolent and entitled, they're successful without any effort. And actually, we saw this back in 1776. Adam Smith, right? The
invisible hand of the market.
I guess, but the oracle of American capitalism, right? Like, he actually predicted that this would happen, and that you would get this jungle-like marketplace that would ensure that the religions that are best at attracting and keeping members would survive. And James Madison predicted something very similar. He used this idea of the thriving religious marketplace to help sell church-state separation in the early days when they were inventing it here in this country. It's just one of the reasons it's so sad that the Supreme Court has gone so far away from that, and it's one of the reasons that I said that Christian nationalism is un-American, and used that as a subtitle for my first book. It's so true.
Well, this has been such a fascinating conversation, Andrew. I hope you'll come back on to talk with us about one of the other big cases this term involving Catholic Charities in Wisconsin and not wanting to pay unemployment taxes for an untold number of employees. So let's get you back on next week when you have some time to talk about that case, because I think it also is another monumental decision in the making that really could unmoor just basic taxation regulation involving entities that aren't actually even churches, but are just associated with a church. And I think it has huge implications for our healthcare system. So come back on. Please come join me again. Come join us here at Legal AF with Court Accountability.
I'd love to.
Excellent. I'm going to say yes to your yes. And we will see you again soon. Thank you for sharing with us your observations from the Supreme Court argument this morning, and also going forward with your deep analysis and understanding of the history. We will get your great books displayed for folks so they can find them easily. And everyone, please do please subscribe, please share these videos. And Andrew, thank you so much for coming on. I'm Lisa Graves with Court Accountability Action and Legal AF with the Midas Touch Network.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.